It was the spring of 1874 when the people of Tennessee Bend began to whisper again. Down by the river's curve, where the water turned black under the cypress trees, a single column of smoke rose each day from an old forge. That forge once sang with life. It belonged to Eli Turner, the finest blacksmith this side of the Mississippi. There wasn't a plow, wagon wheel, or horseshoe he couldn't shape to perfection, but those days were gone. Now the rhythmic clang of hammer and anvil had changed. The villagers said it sounded slower, heavier, like grief beating against iron. The old women who gathered by the general store spoke in hushed tones. "He don't make no tools no more." "What's he making then?" "Coffins." They crossed themselves when they said it. No one wanted to ask why. Eli Turner was a tall, broad man with soot-streaked skin and a face that seemed carved from stone. His hair, once black, had begun to gray too early. Inside his workshop, the air was thick with smoke, sawdust, and sorrow. Half-finished coffins leaned against the walls. Wooden shavings curled like fallen petals around his boots. He moved methodically, cutting, planing, hammering, sanding, each coffin crafted as though it were meant for royalty. He never sold them for profit. Often he didn't charge at all. Eli's wife, Martha, had died the previous winter, taken by fever in the cruelest month of January. Before that, his forge had been filled with laughter and the smell of bread she'd bake while he worked. Now it was silent, except for the steady beat of his hammer, echoing like a broken heart refusing to stop. One foggy morning, as the blacksmith worked, a small shadow appeared in his doorway. It was Tommy, the baker's son, barely 8 years old. His clothes were patched and his voice timid. "Sir," the boy said, twisting his hat in his hands, "Ma says you don't make plows no more. Says you only make boxes for the dead." Eli didn't look up. The forge roared behind him, glowing like the belly of a beast. "Your ma's right, boy." Tommy hesitated. "Ain't that sad work?" Finally, Eli turned, his eyes red from heat and sleepless nights. He studied the boy for a long moment, then said quietly, "Sad work, son, is leaving something undone. This work, this is remembering." Tommy didn't understand, but he nodded. And for a brief moment, the man who had buried love itself gave a faint smile. That evening, Eli sat by the Tennessee River where he and Martha had walked on their courting nights. The wind carried the scent of honeysuckle and wet clay. The river murmured softly against the stones, like an old friend trying to console him. He watched the current pull at the moonlight and whispered, "I forge coffins, Martha, because it's all that's left of me." Sometimes, when the night was still enough, he swore he could hear her humming an old hymn from across the water. But the sound would fade before it reached him, leaving only the rustle of the reeds and the ache in his chest. One afternoon, a wagon rolled into town, pulled by a weary mule and driven by a man in a preacher's collar. He was Reverend Samuel Cole, a traveling minister from Memphis. When he heard about the blacksmith who made coffins instead of tools, curiosity led him straight to the forge. Inside, the preacher watched Eli work for several minutes before speaking. "You waste your gift, son," he said. "There's life all around you, yet you work for the dead." Eli's hammer paused mid-swing. Without looking up, he replied, "The dead never complain, Reverend. The living do." The preacher frowned. "And yet it's the living who need you most." Eli finally met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "You'd think so," he said softly, "but they stop coming once you've buried one of your own." The Reverend said nothing more. He simply tipped his hat, left a prayer card on the table, and walked away into the dust. It was near sundown when a woman came to Eli's forge, her shawl soaked from rain. Her name was Mary Lou Jacobs, a widow whose husband had died in a mine collapse 3 days prior. She clutched a worn letter in one hand and a handful of coins in the other. "Mr. Turner," she said through trembling lips, "they told me you'd make him a box. But I can't pay what's fair." Eli looked at her coins, barely enough to buy a loaf of bread. He shook his head gently. "The river gives, and it takes. You owe me nothing, ma'am." That night, Eli worked until dawn. He shaped the coffin as if it were for someone he loved, polishing every edge, smoothing every surface, carving tiny vines into the lid. At sunrise, he stood over the finished coffin and whispered, "Sleep easy, whoever you are." The villagers began to talk again. Some said Eli had gone mad. Others said grief had turned his heart to stone. But one old man at the general store said softly, "No, friends, his heart's still warm. He just keeps it buried deeper than most." Inside the forge, above the anvil, hung a single photograph. Martha, smiling faintly in her wedding dress, her hair tied back with lace. It was the only clean thing in the workshop. Every time Eli raised his hammer, the motion brought her memory back. The clang of iron echoed her laughter. The hiss of cooling metal sounded like her whisper in the night. And every coffin he built carried a secret. Hidden beneath the lining, he carved her initials, MT. It was his way of letting her live again, piece by piece, in every soul he sent to rest. Weeks passed. Then, one cold morning, little Tommy came running to the forge again, this time with tears streaking his face. "Mr. Eli," he cried, gasping for breath, "Pa's real sick. The doctor says he won't make it." Eli froze, the hammer slipping from his hand. His stomach turned, cold. That night, as the town fell quiet, the church bell tolled once, slow and heavy. The sound drifted down the river bend like a lament. Eli lit his forge again. His shadow danced against the flames as he began shaping another coffin, each strike slower than the last. When the work was done, he laid his hand on the wood and whispered, "Forgive me, Lord, for I am tired of death." Eli hadn't prayed since Martha's funeral, but that night he knelt by the forge, his hands trembling, his face streaked with soot and tears. He stared into the glowing embers and said, "If you've left any purpose for me beyond death, show it now. I'm done burying the living before their time." The forge crackled softly in response, as though listening. Outside, a low rumble of thunder rolled over the hills, the promise of a storm. By dawn, the rain began to fall, not a gentle rain, but a furious one that tore shingles from rooftops and swallowed the roads whole. The Tennessee River rose fast, flooding homes and barns. And for the first time in years, Eli Turner ran, not away from death, but toward life. The storm raged for 2 days. The river burst its banks, sweeping away fences, crops, and dreams. Families huddled in the church, hungry and afraid. Eli worked without rest. He tore planks from his own workshop to patch broken roofs. He hammered makeshift braces for doors. He used the same tools, once meant for coffins, to build bridges and shelters. When the flood finally receded, Tennessee Bend looked battered, but not broken. And in the middle of it all stood Eli Turner, covered in mud and ash, staring at his ruined forge. Reverend Cole approached, laying a hand on his shoulder. "Seems the Lord answered your prayer," he said gently. Eli gave a tired smile. "Maybe he reminded me," he replied, "that I wasn't meant to bury the living before their time." The preacher nodded. "Then you've been reborn, son." Eli looked toward the horizon where the river met the sky, and for the first time in months he felt something stirring inside him, something almost like peace. Days after the storm, Reverend Cole returned to Eli's workshop. The forge still stood, though the roof sagged and the floor was soaked in mud. Eli sat inside, turning a half-bent horseshoe in his hands. "Storm spared your anvil," the preacher said with a faint smile. Eli looked up. "It's the only thing that never leaves me." Reverend Cole chuckled softly. "Maybe that's because it's your altar. Every man needs one, something to build his prayers upon." Eli's eyes softened. "Then maybe I've been praying all along, Reverend, only I didn't know it." The preacher nodded slowly. "Then pray louder, son. This town needs its blacksmith again." For the first time in months, Eli walked out of his forge, not toward the graveyard, but toward the living. A week later, a wagon stopped outside the forge. A man carried his little daughter in his arms, a frail girl named Clara, no more than 10 years old. Her leg was bound with rough bandages and a broken wooden crutch. "Mr. Turner," her father said nervously, "Doc says she needs a new crutch." "I can't pay much, but," Eli interrupted him gently. "Bring her in." He examined the broken crutch, and then the girl's small, curious eyes. "You like flowers?" he asked. She nodded shyly. Eli smiled and began to work. The forge glowed, sparks danced, and the scent of pine filled the air. When he was done, he handed her a new crutch, strong, smooth, and carved with little wildflowers along its length. Clara's eyes widened. "It's beautiful. Strong as iron," Eli said softly. She hugged him. That simple touch, so pure, so innocent, broke something open in Eli's chest. For the first time since Martha's death, he felt warmth that wasn't from the fire. Word spread fast across Tennessee Bend. Eli Turner was making tools again. Farmers came for plows and shovels. Riders came for horseshoes. Mothers brought pots to mend and hinges to fix. Every day the sound of Eli's hammer echoed through the valley like a heartbeat returning to life. Children gathered near the door to watch the sparks fly. They whispered stories about the man who could bend metal like magic. And though Eli smiled more often now, he still walked to the churchyard every Sunday evening. He'd sit by Martha's grave, brush the leaves from her stone, and tell her about his day. About Clara, about Tommy, about the people he was helping again. "You'd be proud, Martha," he would whisper. "You always said I had more fire in me than I knew." The wind through the trees always seemed to answer, soft and warm. Spring turned to summer. One afternoon, a loud crash echoed from the hilltop church. The old iron cross on the steeple had fallen, snapping clean in two. The townsfolk gathered, murmuring that it was a bad omen. Eli stepped forward. "Let me fix it." For days he worked, melting, hammering, reforging. The metal resisted him, warped by years of wind and rain. But Eli persisted. Every blow of his hammer was a prayer, every spark a testament. When the cross was done, it gleamed like sunlight on the river. The entire town came to watch him raise it back to the steeple. Reverend Cole said quietly, "You've mended more than iron today, Eli Turner." And that night, as Eli looked up at the cross shining under the moon, he felt Martha's presence so vividly it brought tears to his eyes. That night, Eli dreamed of Martha. She stood in the forge doorway, wearing the same simple dress she had on the day they met. Her hair fell around her shoulders, her smile soft as morning light. "Eli," she whispered, "you've built enough beds for the dead. It's time to build bridges for the living." He reached out for her, but she faded into smoke, leaving behind only the scent of her favorite lilacs. When he woke, his pillow was damp with tears. The forge fire had gone cold, but his heart burned bright. He rose before dawn, rekindled the flames, and began work anew. Not for grief, but for grace. A letter arrived from upriver, a desperate plea. A nearby town was struck by a plague. They needed coffins, hundreds of them, and fast. Eli stared at the letter for a long time. The old grief stirred inside him, whispering, "This is your work. This is what you were made for." He walked outside, staring at the river that had once taken everything from him. Then he said aloud, "No, I will not feed death again." He packed his wagon, not with coffin wood, but with nails, saws, timber, and iron. When he reached the plague-stricken town, he built not boxes, but beds, stretchers, water pumps, and tools for digging new wells. Some lived, some didn't. But those who survived did so because of what he built. And when he returned home, the people of Tennessee Bend lined the road to greet him. For once, Eli Turner didn't look like a man haunted by the past. He looked like a man redeemed by purpose. A week later, the townsfolk gathered outside his forge with food, candles, and gifts. Children carried baskets of bread. Farmers brought wood. Even Reverend Cole brought a Bible bound in leather. Then little Tommy, the baker's son, stepped forward holding a wooden plaque. He handed it to Eli, his voice trembling with pride. "It says what we all feel, Mr. Turner." Eli took the plaque and read the carved words aloud. "Eli Turner, the man who forged hope." The crowd cheered softly, and Eli felt his throat tighten. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "You see that, Martha? They remember me for something other than death." And though no one else heard it, a soft breeze moved through the crowd, like a sigh of approval from somewhere beyond. Late that summer, disaster struck again. A spark leapt from the forge onto a pile of straw. Within minutes, the fire roared, devouring the workshop that had once been Eli's heart and home. Villagers formed a chain, passing buckets of water, shouting, praying, but the fire raged on. When dawn broke, the forge was nothing but blackened timbers and ash. They searched the ruins, fearing the worst. But there, in the middle of the ashes, sat Eli Turner, alive, soot-covered, clutching Martha's portrait to his chest. "I couldn't save the forge," he whispered hoarsely, "but I saved her." Reverend Cole knelt beside him. "You saved more than that, Eli. You saved this town. The fire can take your walls, but it can't touch your work." The people nodded, and right then, they made a silent vow. The forge that gave them hope would rise again. Through the fall and winter, the townsfolk came together to rebuild Eli's forge. Every man, woman, and child offered something: a plank, a nail, a hammer stroke, or a prayer. Eli watched with misty eyes as they worked. When it was finished, it looked grander than before, stronger, brighter, alive. On opening day, Eli hung a new iron sign above the door: "Turner Forge, Tools for the Living." And beneath the sign, he placed a small metal plate bearing Martha's initials, MT. People said that, at night, when the forge fire burned low, you could see her reflection in the glow, smiling, content. Eli spent his remaining years teaching Tommy and Clara how to shape metal, how to temper it with fire, how to build not just with hands, but with heart. Many years later, when Eli Turner passed quietly in his sleep, the town wept as though they'd lost kin. They buried him beside Martha, overlooking the Tennessee River he had once cursed and later forgiven. Tommy inherited the forge, now a young man with strong hands and a heart full of purpose. One evening, as he cleaned the workshop, he found something tucked in a corner: an old, unfinished coffin, black with age. Inside it lay a single folded note written in Eli's rough handwriting. "Death took my wife, but grief gave me purpose. If you ever forget why you forge, remember this: it's not the iron that shapes a man, but what he builds for others." Eli Turner, 1874. Tommy placed the note back and covered the coffin gently with cloth. Then he stoked the forge, letting the fire blaze high. And as the sparks rose into the night sky, It looked to every soul in Tennessee Bend as if Eli Turner's spirit was still there, hammering hope into the heart of the living.